It started with a drone crash, of all things. 1 second, I was trimming a raspberry bush behind my shed, and the next, a loud pop echoed through the yard as a small quadcopter spiral dived into the side of my compost bin like a kamikaze mosquito. I blinked, dropped my clippers, and walked over, expecting maybe a kid's toy or some curious teenager's weekend project. What I didn't expect was the camera, still recording, and the little HOA logo stickered onto its plastic wing. That's when I realized someone was spying on my shed. Again. Now, I've lived in this cul-de-sac for 5 years, and I've kept a low profile on purpose. I mind my own business, pay my dues, even when they spike mysteriously every spring, and keep my lawn trimmed just under the fascist 4-inch limit the HOA newsletter is so proud of. But lately, Karen, yes, that's her real name, and yes, she embodies every syllable, had taken a weird interest in the back corner of my property where my shed sits. The shed itself is unremarkable. Brown, weatherproofed, big enough to hold tools and my old motorcycle project that's been on a 10-year sabbatical. But for some reason, Karen had convinced herself it was the epicenter of something unwholesome, her word, not mine. She even left a note on my front door last week that read, "Several of us have noticed strange activity near your structure. Please be advised that the HOA will be conducting a review." No signature. Just that delightful tone of passive-aggressive bureaucracy only HOA lifers know how to conjure. So when the drone hit the bin, I knew it wasn't an accident. It was surveillance. Amateurs but determined ones. I plucked the drone from the bin, pulled the SD card, and plugged it into my laptop. What popped up was pure gold. Hours of grainy footage aimed directly at my shed, zoomed in like it was a high-security prison wing. There was even audio, mostly wind and birdsong, until the last clip. Karen's voice, unmistakable and nasal, floated through the speakers. "He's hiding something back there. I don't know what it is, but it's illegal. No one just has a shed that locked. He doesn't even let the landscapers go near it." I paused the video. First of all, I mow my own lawn. Second, the shed lock? That was installed after Karen's schnauzer got into my gasoline storage 3 summers ago and had to be rushed to the vet because it drank half a quart of weed killer. That should have ended the drama. Instead, she turned it into a vendetta. The thing is, Karen isn't just any nosy neighbor. She's the HOA Vice President, self-appointed chair of the Architectural Oversight Committee, and a real estate agent whose entire personality is wrapped around controlling property values and other people's lives. Her house is directly across from mine, painted the exact beige mandated by the HOA charter, with fake tulips in every flowerbed because real flowers attract bees. I sat back, fingers steepled, watching the drone footage again. She really thought she'd uncovered something. And then, inspiration hit, not revenge, not yet. I wasn't mad. I was amused. I decided to play it just subtle enough to make her unravel herself. The next morning, I pulled my motorcycle out of the shed. Well, wheeled it out. It doesn't run, but Karen doesn't know that. I set it on a new tarp in the driveway, opened the shed wide like a theatrical curtain, and went about working on something inside. Just enough to trigger curiosity. I even brought out a couple of locked aluminum cases from the garage and moved them mysteriously inside. Within an hour, Karen was walking her dog past my driveway for the 3rd time. I gave her a friendly wave. She didn't wave back. That night, I received an anonymous email. It came from an address that read Neighborhood Integrity Watch at protonmail.com, and the subject line was Suspicious Activity on Property. Attached was a PDF, a copy of an HOA complaint filed under Community Safety Concern, citing odd machinery, frequent shed usage, and potential unauthorized renovations. She even flagged possible weapons storage, based on video evidence. I chuckled. She was sending drone footage to the HOA. That's when I realized Karen had stopped being annoying. She'd crossed into something else, something reckless. But it didn't stop there. 2 days later, I got a knock on the door. It wasn't Karen or even her pet board president. It was two men in plain clothes flashing badges, actual federal ones. Homeland Security. They were polite, professional, and serious. One of them had a thick Midwestern accent and carried a clipboard with my name on it. "Sir," he said, "we've received a tip regarding unusual traffic and activity at this address. Do you mind answering a few questions?" Now, I'm not stupid. I asked to see their credentials, checked their badges, and even called the listed field office number just to be sure. They were real. I invited them in. I figured the fastest way to clear this up was to let them see how boring I was. I walked them through the house, showed them the shed, explained the motorcycle, and even pointed out the drone. One of them snorted when I played Karen's audio. The other agent, a tall guy with a tired expression and army posture, rubbed his chin. "You got any idea who sent the tip?" "Oh, I have a strong suspicion," I said, deadpan. "She lives right over there and thinks anyone who owns a padlock is probably running a meth lab." They left after about 20 minutes, clearly unimpressed with my compost, weed trimmer, and stack of motorcycle manuals. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 3 days later, I woke up to sirens. Not faint ones. These were right outside. I pulled up my blinds and nearly choked on my coffee. 4 black SUVs, 2 marked police cruisers, and a full-on mobile command unit were parked across the street, in front of Karen's house. Agents were walking up her driveway in tactical vests. One had a battering ram. Another was reading something into a loudspeaker. Karen was on the porch, screaming. Her husband stood there in a robe, mouth hanging open like he couldn't decide whether to run or faint. And then they went in. They actually raided her house. I threw on a hoodie, walked outside like I was just checking my mail, and stood next to old man Reese from next door, who was recording the whole thing on his phone. "Looks like someone finally got what was coming," he muttered, eyes twinkling. I raised an eyebrow. "What's going on?" Reese didn't even look up from his screen. "Heard she was using her realtor license to run some kind of title scam. Feds been building a case for months. Guess someone tipped them off to check her home office." I blinked slowly. Huh. And in that moment, standing on my lawn watching the HOA Vice President get cuffed on her own porch, I realized something strange. For once, I hadn't done anything. Not really. I'd just opened a shed. Karen had raided herself. By noon, the neighborhood was buzzing, both metaphorically and literally. Karen's house had become the epicenter of lawn chair surveillance. Retired couples were standing shoulder to shoulder on porches with iced tea in hand, kids were pretending to ride bikes, just a little too slowly past her driveway, and every Ring doorbell within a 3-house radius had probably captured a dozen different angles of her getting hauled off in handcuffs. The same woman who once fined a teenager for having a skateboard ramp visible from the sidewalk was now the star of her very own federal crime scene. I, of course, played dumb. When a few curious neighbors wandered over later that day, I gave them the same shrug I'd been practicing in the mirror. No idea what happened. I mean, she did seem kind of stressed lately. Maybe a tax thing? It was a delicate balance. I wanted to enjoy this. No, I deserved to enjoy this, but I couldn't afford to gloat. Not yet. There was still the matter of the drone, the false report to the feds, and the weaponized HOA nonsense she'd been slinging for weeks. She'd started something serious, and while karma had knocked her off her pedestal in record time, I wasn't about to let the aftermath blow over without a proper cleanup. The next morning, I visited the HOA office. It was tucked inside a repurposed dentist's office off Maple and 3rd, all beige walls and laminated inspirational quote. I walked in wearing my cleanest flannel and my friendliest fake smile. Donna, the HOA secretary, was behind the desk, hunched over a stack of newsletters with a pen in her mouth. "Morning," I said casually. "I'm here to request a copy of any reports filed against my property in the last 30 days. Under the transparency clause, I believe I have that right." Donna blinked, the pen still between her teeth. Sure. Just give me a minute." She disappeared into a back room, and I could hear the sound of a printer starting up and someone whispering something I couldn't quite make out. When she returned, she handed me 3 stapled pages. On top, Community Incident Summary, Lot Number 17. My lot. I sat down in the vinyl chair and flipped through the pages slowly, taking in every detail. There were 3 separate complaints, all filed anonymously but clearly referencing the same anonymous witness. Each one used similar phrasing: suspicious behavior, unexplained mechanical activity, potential illegal storage. The final line of one entry caught my eye: may warrant local or federal attention due to national security risk indicators. National security risk. Karen had apparently decided I was running a domestic terror cell out of my lawn shed because I owned a propane tank and some aluminum toolboxes. Donna, I said, keeping my tone light, do you know who submitted these? She looked uncomfortable. Well, no, but you know the board. They review everything before it's logged. And the board at that time consisted of? She hesitated. Karen Morrison, Mike Talley, and Deborah Hastings. I nodded. Right. Well, I'll be formally contesting these and requesting a retraction in writing. Also, you might want to hold off on letting Karen sign any more documents, what with the whole raid thing. Her eyes widened. We're temporarily suspending her voting privileges. Smart. I left with the papers tucked under my arm and my next stop clear in my mind. Mike Talley, HOA President, lifelong insurance salesman, mustache like a walrus and the spine of a wet Q-tip. I found him on his porch later that afternoon, sipping something suspiciously dark from a world's best grandpa mug. Mike, I greeted him. Hey there, he replied, wary. I held up the papers. Got these from the office. Thought we could talk. He motioned me to sit, clearly not thrilled. Listen, man, if this is about the complaints, it is. But it's also about Karen using the HOA as a personal attack dog. She filed fake reports, tampered with evidence, and submitted drone footage taken illegally over my property. That's multiple violations of HOA ethics, assuming those exist, and likely some criminal ones too. He shifted in his seat. We didn't know she filed a tip with the feds. She literally wrote, may warrant federal attention. On HOA paper. That alone could get you all named in a lawsuit if I felt like being litigious. He looked alarmed. Okay, look. We'll open a review. We'll pull her from the board, okay? I stared at him for a long moment. That's a start. But I want a full retraction. And I want it in the next HOA bulletin, with a note that all previous complaints against lot number 17 are void. That's going to ruffle feathers. Not as much as a civil suit. He took another sip from his mug, probably whiskey. You're a pain in the ass, you know that? I grinned. But a quiet one. Unlike your vice president. By the next HOA meeting, held in the school gym with plastic folding chairs and tepid coffee, Karen's name had been scrubbed from the seating chart. Deborah Hastings was promoted to interim VP, and while she was every bit as snooty as Karen, she didn't have the same appetite for crusades. I stood up during the community concerns portion and read a brief, polite statement about neighborly boundaries, false allegations, and the importance of de-escalation. It was so dry and neutral, you could hear the passive aggression sizzling off it like bacon grease. I didn't name names. I didn't have to. Everyone already knew. But just as I thought things were finally cooling off, something weird happened. A week after the meeting, I came home to find my mailbox wide open. Inside was an unmarked envelope. No return address. Inside, a single sheet of paper. Printed on it was a list of dates, addresses, and license plate numbers, none of which were mine. It looked like a ledger or a tracker of some kind. And at the very bottom was a handwritten note. You didn't hear this from me. Ask about Coastal Transfers, LLC. I sat down on my porch, envelope in hand, and felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I hadn't planned to push further. Karen was already dealing with enough. But this? This wasn't a prank. This was something deeper. That night, I booted up my laptop and searched Coastal Transfers LLC. It took some digging. Deep web forums, county clerk records, and an old realtor newsletter Karen once spammed to the entire neighborhood, but the truth started to emerge. It was a shell company, a fake business, and according to public records, it had been used to file several property title transfers in the past year, all in our zip code. The kicker? Most of the sold properties were still occupied by families who didn't even know their deeds had been quietly reassigned. It hit me then. Karen's obsession with property values, her realtor license, the meticulous way she kept records on everyone's home. She hadn't just been enforcing rules. She'd been collecting data, targeting vulnerable homeowners, creating fake sales, filing forged documents, and I had a feeling my shed had nothing to do with it, except maybe that it was the one thing on my lot she couldn't catalog, the one place she couldn't peek into. So she tried to get it torn down, or me evicted. Only the shed stayed. And now I had her scent. She wanted a war of documents? She was about to lose everything on paper. The next morning, I drove downtown to the county recorder's office. I'd barely slept, running on curiosity and spite at this point, but adrenaline kept me sharp. I'd printed out the note from the mailbox, circled the words Coastal Transfers LLC, and tucked it into a folder with a few of Karen's previous complaint filings and the drone footage stills. I wasn't about to go full conspiracy theorist, but if what I suspected was even half true, Karen wasn't just a nosy neighbor with too much time and an overactive imagination. She was a criminal. And the HOA? They'd either been her enablers or her cover. The woman at the records desk was in her 60s. Wearing readers on a chain and a smile that said she'd seen 1,000 odd requests and wasn't fazed by a single one. I gave her the name of the company and asked if there were any recent filings involving them in our zip code. She tapped away for a few minutes and tilted her head. That's strange. Good strange, or the kind that ends in news cameras? Depends, she said, squinting at the monitor. They've filed 9 quitclaim deeds in the last 14 months. All local. But 3 of the properties are still listed as owned by the original residents in the tax records. I leaned forward. Meaning either they filed but never followed through or someone's falsifying documents. She printed out the list for me. Sure enough, my neighbors the Mendels, the sweet couple with the orange cat who always escaped, were on the list. So were the townhomes over on Redwood Street and one of the old rentals near the church. I recognized every address. These weren't empty flips. These were lived-in homes. And Karen? Her name didn't show up directly. But the signature on the prepared by line on each filing? K. Morrison. I stared at the page, jaw tight. I called the Mendels on my drive back. We'd only ever exchanged cookies and holiday cards, but I figured, hey, did you know someone tried to reassign your property title? Was a decent excuse for a neighborly check-in. Mrs. Mendel was shocked. She put me on speaker for her husband, who dug through their mail and, sure enough, found an odd letter from a Coastal Transfers LLC saying they'd successfully processed their title reassignment. They dismissed it as spam. They met me at their place 15 minutes later, visibly shaken. I explained everything I'd found, showed them the documents, and offered to put them in touch with a real estate lawyer I knew from college. Mr. Mendel clapped me on the shoulder and said, "You're not just a good neighbor, son. You might have saved our home." But the more people I spoke with, the more pieces fell into place. One neighbor remembered Karen, offering to help navigate some paperwork, when their uncle passed and left them the house. Another recalled a weird meeting at the HOA office where Karen asked to see people's deed documents for record updates. It was always framed as a courtesy, a helpful service, until someone didn't play ball, and suddenly the HOA was citing them for paint color violations, fence height discrepancies, and all manner of nuisance reports. It hit me like a freight train. She wasn't just using the HOA as a weapon. She was using it as a data farm. Names, addresses, property histories, vulnerabilities. If you didn't know any better, it looked legitimate. If you didn't push back, you might never realize your deed had been quietly reassigned under your nose. And those aluminum cases I'd carried into my shed to mess with her? She probably thought I was running the same game. Competition. That's why she escalated. She saw me as a threat to her little kingdom of fraud. Well, now she was the one being watched. I compiled everything: drone footage, her HOA complaints, the forged filings, the timeline, the anonymous note, and sent it to a contact I had at the local FBI field office. The same guy who had visited me during the original investigation. I kept my tone professional, flagged it as a follow-up, and laid out what I believed. Karen Morrison wasn't just filing false reports. She was exploiting HOA access to run a sophisticated title fraud scam targeting her own neighbors. By the time I hit send, I was sweating. 3 hours later, I got a reply. It was short. Can we meet? Tomorrow, 10 a.m. Our office. When I walked into the FBI office the next day, the air felt different, heavier. My contact, Agent Ramirez, met me at the door and didn't waste time on pleasantries. We've been building a broader case around property fraud in suburban communities. You just filled in a missing link. He motioned for me to follow. Down the hall, past a bullpen of agents and into a glass-walled conference room where files were already open. On one monitor, Karen's face stared back at me, frozen in a still from a neighborhood Zoom call. She's more than a local annoyance, he said. She's part of a pattern. We've seen similar filings in 3 counties, all routed through shell LLCs. Coastal Transfers is just one of them. Guess who shows up in all of them? I didn't answer. He tapped the screen. She's good. She exploits legal gray zones, loopholes in HOA charters, and the fact that most people don't check their land records until it's too late. But the drone footage? The complaints? The anonymous tip? That was a gold mine. Can you take her down? I asked. He gave me a look that said we already are. With what you gave us. Oh yeah. But we're going for everything. Fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit real estate theft, impersonating a title officer. Could be federal prison. I left that building lighter than I'd felt in weeks. The fallout came fast. Within a week, the neighborhood newsletter announced that Karen Morrison had been formally removed from all HOA positions pending an ongoing investigation. Within 2, the county posted public notices flagging all Coastal Transfers filings as potentially fraudulent. The Mendels? Cleared. The townhome owners? Reinstated. Karen's house was officially seized as part of the investigation. That made 2 houses on my street with crime scene tape on them in 1 month. She hadn't even had time to get her fake tulips out of the flower beds before they locked her doors. Neighbors started stopping me on walks. You were right, some whispered. We thought you were just messing with her. I wasn't proud of it, but I let them believe whatever version made them feel safe. Truth was, I'd only pulled the thread. She'd woven the whole sweater. One night, as I was sitting on my porch sipping a cold beer, an unfamiliar car pulled up in Karen's old driveway. A real estate sign went up. The agent nodded politely at me as he hammered it into the ground. New listing, he said. Bank owned, going up for auction. I just nodded. Hope the new neighbors like sheds. He laughed and walked off. I stayed there on the porch long after the sun set, watching shadows dance across the lawn. I didn't smile. Not exactly. But there was something satisfying about the silence. The kind that comes after a storm that finally takes the whole rotten tree down. The shed door creaked open in the breeze. And just like that, Karen Morrison became the cautionary tale she'd always warned everyone else about. The house sat empty for a few weeks after the foreclosure sign went up. Occasionally, someone from the county or the bank came by to do an inspection or retrieve evidence from Karen's home office, if you could call her cluttered sunroom with 2 printers and a 5-foot corkboard full of red string a home office. But for the most part, it became a monument to her downfall. Even the tulips began to sag, forgotten in the oppressive summer heat. It was poetic in a petty sort of way. I thought that would be the end of it, that Karen was gone for good, the neighborhood had returned to equilibrium, and my shed could live its life in peace as a glorified motorcycle casket. But I should have known better. People like Karen don't vanish quietly, they echo. It started with an email from the HOA. Subject: Urgent Architectural Compliance Audit. At first glance, it looked routine. They were conducting a community-wide review of existing structures for compliance with HOA bylaws. But when I read further, I noticed something strange. They were requesting internal access to detached outbuildings, specifically sheds, for insurance assessment purposes. That wasn't standard. In fact, it was a complete overstep. The HOA had no right to inspect inside any privately owned building unless it was undergoing approved renovations or presented a public safety risk. And I hadn't filed for any changes. Not since Karen had tried to nuke me with drone footage. So why were they suddenly interested in the inside of my shed again? I forwarded the email to Agent Ramirez. Within the hour, I got a phone call. "Don't let anyone in," he said bluntly. "We've been monitoring internal communications between former HOA board members and outside parties. We have reason to believe someone's trying to recover something Karen hid." My blood went cold. "In my shed?" "No," he said, "but she might have used her authority to stash items near your property line. Maybe buried. Maybe disguised. We've seen this before. False reports used to establish access to adjacent land for retrieval later." That's insane. That's Karen. So now, apparently, I wasn't just the guy who accidentally took down the HOA queenpin. I was also sitting on potential evidence. That night, I walked the perimeter of my yard with a flashlight and a metal detector I borrowed from a friend who teaches middle school science. I figured if there was anything buried, I might as well find it before someone else did. I didn't expect to find much. Maybe an old sprinkler head or soda can. But halfway through scanning the hedgerow that bordered my shed, the detector beeped. I brushed away the leaves and poked around with a small trowel. 3 inches below the surface, I hit something solid. It was a waterproof case. Gray plastic, about the size of a lunchbox. No labels. No lock. I opened it. Inside were 2 USB flash drives, an envelope with cash. Maybe $2,000, and a folded document titled Backup Title Transfers, Active Listings. I didn't touch anything else. I backed away slowly, grabbed my phone, and called Ramirez again. Within 20 minutes, 2 unmarked cars pulled up to my curb. One agent took the case while the other started photographing the entire scene. Ramirez himself showed up last, unshaven and wearing a windbreaker that made him look like he'd just stepped off a procedural drama set. "You were right," I told him. "She hid stuff." He whistled low. "That's not just stuff. That's her exit plan." He held up the envelope. "This kind of cash isn't to spend. It's to vanish." They dusted for prints, took soil samples, and warned me they'd need to come back with ground-penetrating radar to make sure nothing else was buried. My shed, once a battleground of passive-aggressive property war, was now an active crime scene. Again. The next morning, my street was lined with parked cars. Not from the feds this time, but from news crews. Somehow word had leaked that Karen's property crimes extended into federal territory and possibly involved identity theft and financial fraud across state lines. I spotted 2 vans from major networks and a guy with a boom mic interviewing my elderly neighbor who was wearing a Hawaiian shirt like this was a backyard barbecue. By the time I walked outside, one of the anchors was already pointing at my shed like it was Al Capone's vault. I turned around and went straight back inside. That afternoon, Ramirez returned with a warrant and a radar crew. They scanned the yard, found 2 more metal containers under the hedges, and unearthed a waterproof bag hidden beneath the air conditioning unit. Inside? More USBs. One of them labeled, Staging/Phantom Listings. Apparently, Karen hadn't just forged ownership transfers, she'd built entire fictional listings for houses that didn't exist. Ghost properties. Digital placeholders. She'd even used real addresses with minor misspellings to make them look legitimate, rerouting inspection appointments and escrow notices to P.O. boxes she'd registered across the state. And the kicker? Half of it had been coordinated from a laptop she used while sitting on her porch. The same porch she used to watch me take out the trash. With this new trove of evidence, Ramirez confirmed they'd be expanding the case into a full-blown interstate fraud ring. And I was now considered a key civilian informant. It sounded cooler than it was. Mostly it meant I had to stay quiet while they built a case, provide a few signed affidavits, and try not to lose my mind when news reporters knocked on my door asking for interviews. I declined all of them. I didn't want 15 minutes of fame. I wanted peace. Maybe even a weekend where I could use my shed without someone in a windbreaker asking if they could scan the soil again. But of course, the HOA wasn't going to let this pass quietly either. Despite Karen's removal, the remaining board members, Mike Talley and Deborah Hastings, called an emergency meeting to discuss neighborhood disruptions and restore order. That was code for damage control. They'd invited a few replacement board candidates and even trotted out a consultant from a law firm the HOA had retained. I showed up early, sat in the front row, and brought copies of every false complaint Karen had ever filed about me, along with photos of the buried evidence they'd dug up from my yard. When they opened the floor for public comment, I stood up, walked to the podium, and took a long moment to let the silence stretch. "My name is Evan Weller," I began. "You know me. You fined me for painting my fence the wrong shade of brown. You accused me of storing explosives in a gardening shed. You allowed a known fraud to weaponize your authority and manipulate her way into dozens of property records. And now you want to talk about restoring order." Mike squirmed. Deborah tried to cut me off. I raised my hand. "I'm not done. Your organization aided and abetted a crime ring because you didn't want to push back on someone who brought cookies to meetings and knew how to use a spreadsheet. If you're serious about restoring anything, here's what needs to happen. 1. Full audit of every HOA complaint in the past 2 years. 2. Independent oversight of property dispute. 3. A formal retraction of all false reports, including those aimed at me and my property. And 4. You all resign." There was a long, uncomfortable pause. Then, from the back row, old Mr. Reese spoke up. "He's right. If you don't step down, we'll vote you out. You work for us, not the other way around." 3 weeks after the emergency HOA meeting, the ballots were counted, the signs taken down, and for the first time since I moved into this neighborhood, I didn't feel like I was walking through a Stepford suburb policed by petty tyrants in pastel polos. The new HOA board consisted of a former nurse named Sheila who actually listened, a quiet high school science teacher named Curtis who had never once fined anyone for mailbox height, and to my great surprise, old Mr. Reese, who ran unopposed for treasurer after announcing, "I'm the only one here who knows how to balance a checkbook and also doesn't want to spy on your begonias." It was peaceful. Almost boring. Which is exactly how I like it. The news coverage faded. The FBI visits tapered off. One day I came home and the last of the caution tape was gone from Karen's former house. The grass had grown tall, the mailbox had been duct-taped shut, and someone had stolen all the fake tulips and replaced them with real sunflowers, which I found poetic. Eventually, the property went to auction. I didn't attend the auction. But someone who did told me it sold for nearly half of what Karen had once bragged it was worth. Apparently, having federal agents raid your living room isn't a huge selling point. I heard whispers that Karen had tried to cut a deal. That she'd started naming names, pointing fingers, maybe even trying to throw the entire HOA under the bus to save herself. But it didn't matter. Her license was gone. Her career was over. And last I heard, she was living in a motel near the state line, awaiting trial. She hadn't come back. But someone had. It was a Tuesday when a white SUV rolled slowly down the street and pulled into the newly auctioned house. A woman stepped out, maybe late 30s, dressed in a plain gray blazer and jeans. Her expression was calm, observant. She looked around like someone memorizing every detail, every house, every neighbor, every angle of the street. She noticed me sitting on my porch with a drink and gave a nod. I raised my glass slightly. New owner. Bank rep, she replied. Temporary. House'll stay vacant for a bit. She glanced across the street at my shed. You the one who found the drives? I lowered my glass. Depends who's asking. She walked over, slow and deliberate. Name's Harper. DOJ Forensic Audit Division. Karen Morrison's not just a local story anymore. My stomach turned. You're saying she's tied to more? Harper nodded. 37 fraudulent filings across 6 counties. 3 shell companies. At least 1 offshore account. She might have been clever, but she wasn't subtle. Tell that to the HOA board, she wrapped around her finger. She smiled faintly. We've been reviewing every complaint she filed. The pattern's pretty clear. Target isolated neighbors, especially those who didn't attend meetings. Use violations to create paper trails, then slide in under the radar when they were distracted. Let me guess, I said. She was training someone to do it next. That's our concern. People like Karen don't build these scams alone. They need silent partners. People to push paper. People who don't ask questions. She reached into her blazer and handed me a manila envelope. Inside were a few black and white photos. Grainy but familiar. One was of Mike Talley shaking hands with a man I didn't recognize in front of a notary sign. Another showed Karen dropping a file into a mailbox labeled Legal Courier Express. The last? A drone image of my backyard, taken weeks before the crash from a much higher altitude. These are from a private investigator Karen used before the drone incident. She was watching your place for months. I sat back in my chair. Why me? Because you didn't play the game. You didn't attend meetings. You fixed your own roof. You never hired her for real estate consulting. You weren't compliant, but you were quiet. That made you unpredictable. I laughed, but it came out hollow. So this whole thing was because I mow my own lawn? In Karen's world? Yeah. Control is everything. She paused. We're closing the investigation soon. We've got enough to bring formal charges against 3 more people. You'll probably be called to testify. I nodded. Just tell me one thing. Did she know it was all coming down? Or did she think she'd walk away clean? Harper looked out at the street. People like her don't believe in consequences. They believe in narrative. To her, she was the one protecting the neighborhood. You were the threat. You always were. She left without giving me a card. Just a nod and the faint sound of her tires crunching the gravel on the way out. I sat there for a long time, thinking. Later that night, I walked to the shed. It was quiet. Still smelled like motor oil and tomato fertilizer. I looked at the spot where the buried case had been, where the soil had been disturbed and later patched. Everything was back in place. Normal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was still buried. Not literally. Not anymore. But deeper. Some small truth about power, about how people like Karen rise. Not because they're brilliant, but because they understand how to exploit silence. That wouldn't happen again. 2 weeks later, I filed to officially amend the HOA charter. Sheila helped me draft the language. Curtis offered to tutor anyone in the neighborhood who didn't understand their property right. Mr. Reese printed off hard copies of every known fraudulent filing and made them available at the community center. We even held a block party. Not a Karen-approved, licensed and permitted monstrosity with color-coordinated streamers and HOA-sanctioned lemonade vendors, but a real one. With music. With laughter. With neighbors who no longer avoided each other out of fear of fines. At one point during the party, someone handed me a burger and asked how I managed to keep my cool through all of it. I shrugged. Just had to remember the long game. Because that's what Karen never understood. Winning isn't about control. It's about endurance. She had the short-term schemes, the clever lies, the committees and the rules and the neighborhood gossip. But in the end, she burned through her empire because she couldn't imagine a world where someone like me, quiet, sarcastic, emotionally restrained, would outlast her. But I did. I still live in the same house. I still have the same shed. The new board has been great. The drone ban passed unanimously. And now, when I wave to my neighbors, they wave back not out of obligation, but out of respect. And Karen? She'll be a story parents tell their kids when they warn them about getting too nosy, about going too far, about thinking a clipboard gives you power over other people's lives. Her name might show up in a law textbook one day. Morrison versus United States. Real estate fraud and misuse of HOA governance. But around here, we just call it the shed incident. And I still haven't fixed the dent where the drone hit my compost bin. Kind of like it that way.